But we're very happy now to welcome Claire Monteleoni that will give a keynote on climate AI. So you're going to hear about a bit of a different field, but it's also using a lot of the techniques that are present in computer vision. I've attended a presentation from Claire already where she was mentioning how close it is to computer vision, and at the same time that not the same tricks work in climate AI that rely a lot on geospatial data. So introducing Claire, she's a researcher director at Inria. She's currently on leave because she was professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. Actually, I look a bit at where you worked. You worked in many, many different places. So let me name them real quick: Harvard, MIT, UC San Diego, Columbia University, George Washington University, Paris-Saclay, CNRS. So I think you kind of traveled the world. As I said, Claire is working a lot on climate AI, stuff like weather forecasting, remote sensing, geospatial data. I've seen also some unique work on avalanche deposit prediction. You'll correct me if I'm wrong. And she's also the co-founder of Climate Informatic Workshop that turned into a conference a couple of years back, right? If I'm correct. So Claire, thanks a lot for being there with us. The room is there to listen to your talk. The floor is yours.
Great. I'm sad not to be there in person. I hope you have a second edition, and then I will come in person. I have not been to Kenya, but I have spent some time in Senegal on the continent, but far away. So this is a photo taken in Aspen, Colorado, a few summers ago. And this maybe provides a happy picture, right? Because we have nature and wildlife and then human infrastructure like the bridge and the power lines, but somehow we're all getting along. You know, the bridge is helping these wildlife to cross the river. And this is a happy picture. This is a sad picture from the same region, but closer to the cities, where I'm using this as an example of where extreme events, extreme weather events, and especially compound extreme events can have outsized impacts on communities. So in this case, the extremes were that where we usually have snow in the fall and winter, we didn't have any in 2021, so it was a dry land cover. And then finally, when the snowstorm was arriving, before any snow arrived, we got very, very strong winds, so anomalously high winds. And basically we had a storm of fire. It took some single ignition. We don't know exactly how it started. But once there was a fire, it basically jumped over our major highways in multiple places, carried by small burning pieces of wood. And it was not even a forest fire. It was spreading on grass and low vegetation. And this is the results. We lost 1,000 homes burned to the ground that one day. And these are just in suburban areas near Denver, Colorado. So not up in the mountains or up in the woods. A similar kind of cascading hazard happened in California. Actually, this is a 2018 event, but there have been similar events more recently in California. And also we've been seeing landslides in the Mediterranean region. And so in this case, there was drought. Then there was a fire in a forested area in the hills above these coastal, highly populated areas. And so when there was a rainfall on the scar left by the fire, there was no vegetation to hold that rainfall, and instead we got a debris flow, so a landslide, and this was quite fatal. So huge rocks and boulders would come into people's houses, and that's why it was so fatal and also damaging to infrastructure. So these sort of extreme events that we're already seeing, as well as the trend that has been identified by scientists of a global warming average trend, has caused me to work on climate informatics, machine learning to address climate change. And I've been working on this for over 16 years, and there are also recognitions of this sort of work. For example, at the Davos World Economic Forum, they put forward a white paper saying, okay, AI can definitely help us advance our industries and technology, but can we also use it to protect our planet? And over the years, as Raul mentioned, we started a workshop, which became a conference. We started publication venues, first the conference proceedings, and now recently a journal on environmental data science. And we found that hackathons were a really good way to spur collaborations. And I think the key that I would say to you folks at this summer school is that you have computer vision skills, or after this summer school, you will have strengthened your computer vision skills. There is somebody at your university or in your city working on an impactful problem. Maybe it's in healthcare. I would encourage you to also work on climate change, but there's a lot of deserving problems. And you want to make relationships with other students in other domains to make these collaborations. And I do say students because the students are the ones that have the time to collaborate with you. And then you'll be getting advice from your advisor, they'll be getting advice from their advisor, and that's how you build interdisciplinary work. We've gotten to the point now where there's a huge demand and interest in working on environmental problems using data science, such as computer vision, machine learning, AI. And since launch, this journal that I mentioned has been doubling in submissions, so it's on an exponential growth trajectory. It's a very exciting time to be here. So this is the end of the day of your summer school, and what I thought I would do was just show you where AI, machine learning, computer vision have been helpful in addressing climate change, and also where there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I run a team now actually called AI Research for Climate Change and Environmental Sustainability. And we operate, I've broken it down into the time frames in which we need these machine learning tools to operate. So the first group of pictures that were about these catastrophic extreme weather events and cascading hazards, these are already happening. And if we're going to have AI-driven prediction systems to help people escape from wildfires, I mean, ideally, we needed solutions for that yesterday. So here we want to design tools and prediction methods in really the short term. And that is under the umbrella of climate change adaptation. And here we also want to work specifically with local communities and decision makers. And I was coming from the US, where there's a legacy of climate injustice. And what does that mean? Certain communities that had lower income or less representation in government were being targeted with polluters, be it incinerators, sewage, factories, which meant that they were having worse public health outcomes than the average communities. And this was a legacy going on for many years and still going on, unfortunately, although people are trying to change it. If you consider something like a prediction system for a wildfire, we have to evacuate the people that are likely in the path of the wildfire, but communities that have a legacy of more vulnerability to air quality degradations, because maybe they've had pollutants in their environment due to environmental injustice, those communities that are more vulnerable to air quality degradation also need to be warned. So designing all our tools to really increase environmental and climate justice is one of our founding principles. So going on to the next bullet, climate change mitigation, or sometimes like in French, they say attenuation of the worst risks of climate change, is saying, what can we do now essentially to reduce carbon emissions so that we don't get into the absolute worst case scenarios of global warming? And so I'll talk a little bit more about this, but mostly we've been trying to speed up the transition to renewable energy sources. And then we can also talk about long-term impacts, these really hard questions that are being asked about, you know, is my lawn going to be flooded in 100 years, or, you know, is a whole city going to be flooded or too hot to survive? And those kinds of questions, we're going to apply AI and machine learning in various ways. Let me give you now the punchline of our approach, which is that we really want to make use of all possible types of data. And in this domain, there are very different types of data. You're probably aware of the satellite remote sensing data, which nowadays, you know, covers the whole globe and has a lot of bands and different channels that are being measured. But that's only in the past, say, 50 to 100 years. There didn't used to be satellites. So when we think about the record of climate change, if you only have a time series that's about 100 years, that's not going to really shed light on the longer term past that we need to understand the climate. So the observation data that we have now with dense weather stations in some locations is great, but you know, it's not spatially equitable, and it also doesn't go far very back in time. So we can't only use observation data. What we can do, and this was sort of our unique observation, was to say there are these models of climate change that are simulated. So basically, the climate modelers since the late 1960s have been building these computer simulations of the climate. The climate system at a broad scale is 4 interacting systems. So the atmosphere and its circulation, the oceans, processes over land, and then processes in the icy regions, the cryosphere. And then all these systems have to get coupled. But even in any individual system, maybe I want to look at evapotranspiration at the, you know, the surface of a body of water. Well, I can write down the mathematical model for that. You know, it's a differential equation with some rate that has been studied for many years, and people feel confident in it. But then how do I simulate that over the whole globe? So they've had to make discretization assumptions, which mean that you're really just going to simulate it in a big cube, maybe 100 kilometers per side. So there were some assumptions and discretizations that had to be made, but for the most part, the idea is if you set up initial conditions, you can run these models, let all the processes interact, respect the energy balances due to the physics, and then you should be able to, you know, take the temperature of the Earth in the future and measure other variables, humidity, pressure at different levels, and at all different locations. What is this? This is big data. Now, it's simulated data, but we have 0 observational data for any point in the future, even tomorrow. So this is our large-scale big data set that can go all the way into the future and all the way into the past. You know, at weather scales, they are trying to predict out 10 days, and at climate scales, they're trying to predict out 100 years under different emissions scenarios. You may have heard of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They're making their predictions to the UN about climate change using these models. So on one extreme, we have large-scale physical simulations that give us synthetic data, but it's the only data we have in the distant future and the distant past, and it's it does encode a lot of scientific first principles and physics that we can trust. On the other hand, we have real ground truth and satellite observation data, but only recently. And I did want to highlight this intermediate product called reanalysis data. And there's been a research field called data assimilation for many years, and mathematicians, physicists, earth scientists have looked into how do we take observation data, and you know, you might have it in the different places, like you can see on the right over parts of North America. We don't have a uniform grid. How do we get a uniform grid of data so that we can feed it to machine learning, which is expecting a matrix or a tensor, as you guys are studying? Well, we could do so by using these physical equations of heat and energy balances to snap it to a latitude-longitude discretization. And this type of data is what has allowed, in the past 2 or 3 years, a revolution in AI for weather prediction. So predicting out to 10 days now, Google DeepMind and Huawei and Microsoft and NVIDIA, a bunch of tech giants have jumped in, and they each use their favorite deep learning model, but they all trained them on a data product that has been developed for many years by scientists using data assimilation. Training on that data set, they've now had weather prediction performance that outperforms the standard weather models that were physics-based. Okay, in terms of the AI methods, my team these days relies heavily on unsupervised learning, where we try to design self-supervised approaches, or semi-supervised pipelines where we have some labeled data. This is because annotated data, there's just by definition less annotated data than just raw data. So we want to do as much as we can with unlabeled data. We do generative AI, and probably later this week you'll hear more about generative AI in the computer vision space. This is not to be confused with in the natural language processing space, where the models are trained on text, so they output text such as ChatGPT. No, I'm talking about the architecture being probabilistic and generative. And so if you train it on historical wind circulation patterns, it can simulate future wind circulation patterns. It'll generate, whatever kind of data you train it on. And then also, when you open your standard computer vision or machine learning textbook and then look at the section on theory, all the theory holds when you have data that is independently identically distributed, meaning often that, okay, the training data distribution is the same as the test data distribution. Then you can prove theorems. But under climate change, that's definitely not the case. So the data is non-stationary or changing, and it's changing not over only time, but also over latitude and longitude. So this is a survey where I'll probably be a little bit more broad than I am deep. I'll try to do one deep dive later, but just broadly as we go through those 3 areas. So, back to those extreme events, AI for extreme weather and cascading hazards. We showed a few years back that using deep learning, we could do hurricane track prediction. And this should look a lot too like computer vision, but we don't actually have, RGB images evolving with time. Instead, we have the real valued matrices of a wind field in the U direction, in the V direction, and then just the height at different geopotential heights. We can take that at various points in the atmosphere, and we can center those fields. I mean, these fields are global, but we can just take patches that are centered around a latitude longitude point. Why do we do this? Well, there's these great data sets of past tropical cyclones and tropical depressions that didn't even make it up to being cyclones or hurricanes. Historical data sets that give you the track. So a latitude longitude pair every 6 hours, and somehow they find the center of the storm and give us that location. So then we can take the wind and pressure fields around that location, and we created data sets for this, both for a hackathon actually on forecasting future intensity, and then for our own work on forecasting the track. We could skillfully forecast the track using actually a fusion of several different pre-trained CNNs. It worked best actually to treat the different channels separately in terms of pre-training, and then learn some linear layers at the end to combine them just by fine-tuning on the full task. And this was competitive at the time. It was competitive with the National Hurricane Center up to about a day ahead. Now with these the tech companies, especially Google and Huawei, are able to make probabilistic forecasts of the track of a hurricane a week ahead that are more skillful than the state-of-the-art physical models. I just also wanted to mention that increasingly governments are folding AI, computer vision, and machine learning methods into what they use in their prediction centers, in their forecasting centers. So we've worked with the meteorological department in India and also here in France. And things like the Indian summer monsoon, they affect the GDP of the whole subcontinent. So if you're going to have high precipitation, you could have flooding, which could ruin agriculture. And if the precipitation is too low, you could have droughts, which also affects the agriculture. So at the beginning of the monsoon season, they would like a seasonal prediction about 3 months out about these precipitation extremes. Even if they can't get that with good accuracy, then they would at least like 5 to 10 day predictions of when you're going to have an extremely wet or dry spell. We have used deep learning in that setting. We've also used techniques from causal analysis, which is another interesting area of AI. And then Raul briefly mentioned our avalanche detection work. I would say the main punchline there is that we had remote sensing data of the avalanche. We had ground truth data literally taken from the ground. People had to trek into dangerous mountains in the winter and look for the deposits of avalanche. This is not even for prediction. This is just detecting whether an avalanche has fallen, and it changes the texture of the snow. And the remote sensing really had trouble detecting that exactly. So we needed those ground truth measurements in order to label the data. But when we did so and used like a supervised deep learner, a CNN, the class imbalance was so bad that it was hard to have much skill. So we ended up leaning on a variational autoencoder, so leaning heavily on the unsupervised part of the pipeline and using that ground truth gold labeling from the humans that trekked there, really only to tune hyperparameters, and got a nice lift that way. So sort of in blue are our aspirational next steps, although we did recently have one paper that I mentioned here. So there's this weather revolution in AI for weather forecasting. And we're really pushing to do more with generative models, because then we can explore a whole range of scenarios, give probability distributions over what's going to happen next, and then also reason about the probability of hazards that might be more rare. We're interested in extreme events, and precipitation is a key to understanding a lot of those, but it's very hard to measure. It's not Gaussian, it's discrete in time and space. Much of it falls over the world's oceans or ice where we can't directly collect it. And so, and then also there are measurement stations. As we showed, there were really dense measurement stations over North America, but different parts of the world have different amounts of weather measurement stations. We have a collaborator with a startup called HD Rain, which was a very smart idea of how to deal with the regions that have less data, including over oceans or over regions that just have less measurement centers, is to actually extract signal from satellite emissions of television signal. So television is sort of broadcast out to from satellites, whether or not people turn on a TV to receive it. But you could do signal processing, and little blips and gaps in the transmission can actually indicate storms, rain, hail, etc. And from there, they're able to measure the precipitation. This weather revolution, the big companies wanted to show how well they did, and on average, they're definitely doing better than the standard physics-driven methods. If you're interested, you can go to the website of ECMWF, the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. Now what they're doing is every day they show the prediction of the AI models from the different companies, and also they have an in-house AI model now at that European Center. and then you can compare it to how well it does with the actual observations. But we know when we design AI and we have a loss function that's good on average, it might not be good in the rare cases. And in many domains, we can just say, oh, those are outliers. Well, actually, those really rare cases with very small signal might be indicative of a rare event that if it happens, it could have big societal impact. So we kind of have to develop the loss functions to handle that better. Moving right along, the second thrust is on mitigation. And I mean, the best thing we can do is to reduce our carbon emissions. We did a project in the US with NREL, the National Renewable Energy Lab, where we showed that we could get a better prediction a week in advance of when it's going to be sunny. So solar energy is only, very strong when it's sunny. And if you are trying to manage the energy grid for a city and you don't exactly know when it's going to be sunny, then that's some kind of a cost on your system because you need to have another power source available. Sorry, I heard a little noise. Is there a question? Okay.
No, that's fine.
Okay. So you've got these potentially more carbon heavy power sources available or expensive power sources available because you have a lot of uncertainty on when it's going to be sunny. We know that AI is very helpful for prediction. ChatGPT predicts what should the next answer to this question be with text, but we can also use deep sequence learning and predict based on the current meteorological conditions, like how sunny it's going to be a week in advance. And this helps with renewable energy planning because if you get a little reduction of uncertainty, that's actually a reduction of cost. And that will help incentivize these grid operators to use renewables. And we have a few projects with EDF, the French energy company that actually also has some projects in Africa. And there the idea is that we have a lot of wind turbines here in France, and so they're generating clean wind energy. But there's evidence that the patterns of wind are also changing under climate change. So the current locations of the wind turbines are not optimal and are not future-proof. We might need to actually move wind turbines, but also redesign them because there's evidence now that average winds are decreasing. So the mean is decreasing of the wind distribution, but that of course means probability mass is going into the tails. So we're going to have extreme winds in some locations, and current wind turbines can't operate with such extreme winds. So the operating characteristics need to be rethought with what wind turbines the electric companies are producing. And same goes for the photovoltaics, because solar irradiance will change as our circulations and cloudiness changes, and same with temperatures. We also are trying to see if AI can shed light on the uncertainty on carbon fluxes due to land use change. I should actually broaden this, not just carbon dioxide, but also methane as part of the carbon cycle. And we know that, if a forest is clear cut and then we have farming, there's some change in the carbon emissions in that location, but it's honestly one of the uncertain areas right now in the field. And so what we're trying to do is use our probabilistic generative AI to train on the data that we do have, or even on the climate modeling data, which we can emulate with AI, and then probabilistically generate new scenarios and compute their impacts. I'm hoping, though, also that the AI revolution in weather will actually reduce the computing needed for weather and climate modeling, because we do see that there's training, but after training, the outputs of these models to predict forward, whether it be 2 weeks, which can be predicted in a few seconds now, with the AI for weather models versus multiple hours, that's reducing compute. So if you're using carbon heavy sources to power your compute, then you could be reducing carbon emissions. And then finally, for impacts, this is where governments and even industry is increasingly asking very hard questions. So we have NASA funding where they're asking us 30 years in the future, what's the average sea level rise going to be, not just average globally, but also over certain islands in the Pacific, for example. So this is really hard, but this gets back to our general idea that, okay, we have 0 observations in the future. So we can use the fake data run by these physical climate models that do simulate a lot of different fields. I mean, they do simulate a sea surface height field, but it's at a very coarse scale. So this is going to relate to our work on downscaling. I will also mention that we could just take the IPCC from the United Nations, look at all their different predictions, and they tend to diverge in the future. They match the historical data pretty nicely because they've been through all these competitions and they've tried to get their models to match the data that we know is ground truth data. Not by direct tuning, just by changing different things of the model. But they really disagree in the future. So the idea is that we can use actually a mixture of experts type online learning to combine them. And that was a thrust of our work. We can also use generative AI to make more ensemble members that are physically plausible and explore other scenarios. Okay, so the thing I've been mentioning a few times is this idea, I don't know if I've said the word, but this an important approach that we've taken is called downscaling. And these really address all tasks in all the different directions that I mentioned. Maybe we could take as an example the task where EDF wants to predict the future wind patterns to make their wind turbines future-proof by designing them for the right operating conditions, wind intensities, and placing them in optimal positions. So then we're looking at, ideally different regions of Africa or France where they're going to put these. Those regions are much smaller than we have simulation data for, because the simulation data, and this was not produced by my group, but I just find it interesting. It's looking at the spatial resolution of simulations versus the temporal resolution. And general circulation models are way up here. I mean, they're coming a little bit closer because people are now trying to make finer and finer resolution simulations. But for the most part, while it's not going to surprise you that we don't simulate snowflakes, these models are not even getting some of the big cyclones and extreme events that we care about, and they're certainly not getting individual clouds. Individual clouds are going to help us understand climate change because they can cool or warm the Earth. But the idea is that we do care about these simulations because it's our only glimpse into the future. So can we use the historical data and the present data that we have to learn an AI model? Let's have it be generative, probabilistic, that can then downscale. What do I mean? Go from coarse grid climate model projections given by the climate models to fine scale that will be at the level that we care about to address adaptation, mitigation, and these other questions. So one thing that we showed, this is a proof of concept in a paper by Brian Gronke, who did a master's in my group, is that we used what were cutting edge at the time, domain alignment techniques using normalizing flows, which are generative methods that sort of generalize a variational autoencoder to learn a posterior distribution over a latent representation of your data that need not be Gaussian. But yeah, I'd encourage you to look up this paper for more details. But sort of the punchline as far as the users are concerned is that it's unsupervised in space. So, sorry, in time. So at a given time, if I have a coarse resolution, in this case, map of precipitation, I don't need for training the fine resolution precipitation map, because that would be supervised, and that's how previous methods worked. I just need access to data of the same variable at the different resolutions. I just need access to some training data from those. And then once I've trained it, it's generative, meaning, so I could condition on this fine resolution image and then generate a coarse resolution image, or I could just sample directly from the latent space, which is not represented here, but then given that sample, I could generate images at fine or coarse resolution space. So we can do downscaling, which is from coarse to fine resolution, but in this case, everything was cycle consistent. So we could also do, upscaling, and then we can give some interpretability to the human stakeholders or to the AI, the weather experts that we're trying to convince them to use AI. We can, so in this case, the model was already trained, then I give it the images at the far right and left ends, which are fine scale precipitation maps at 2 different times. And then we can see how would the AI model represent the interpolation between these 2 times. So we map this through our normalizing flow to the latent space on both ends, and then we can take a walk through the latent space, which, by the way, how to do this is a cutting edge area in core machine learning. But assuming we do have a way to take that walk, then at each point we generate coarse resolution images and fine resolution images. This gives us a picture of what the model believes is the temporal interpolation or evolution of this precipitation pattern in coarse scale, in fine scale. We can get many such samples and we can show them to our domain experts.
Claire?
Yeah?
If you don't mind, there are questions in the room.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just curious. So if we can do simulation, which it seems like the case, we can do a lot of simulation, why do we need AI then?
So the simulation is at a coarser scale in space and time than the individual communities that might be experiencing the wildfire or the regions that EDF is thinking of putting an individual wind turbine. So this is just to do downscaling. Did I answer your question? These simulations.
So it's only about reducing the computation cost, would you say?
No. So if this is at, I get one value for temperature in a 100 kilometer grid box, I actually want to get temperature every 30 meters or every 10 meters. So I actually, in computer vision, it's sometimes called super resolution. So I want to drastically densify my data, but I want to do it in a data-driven way. Super resolution has sometimes been done via bicubic interpolation. So you're assuming some functional form for how you fill in from a coarse scale to a fine scale. But if you want to do it in a completely data-driven way, then we suggest this method using normalizing flows. We basically learn 2 normalizing flows connected to a joint latent space, which allows us to approximate the joint probability distribution between the low res and the high res. So the simulations that we have, these are huge, these are run in high performance computing and in big computing centers. And so, yes, you're right that there's a cost, but not only that, we cannot get simulations at the fine resolutions we need to answer these questions.
Yeah, and I know Asheri was raising hand for a long time, so that's maybe it was connected also to the previous slide. Also highlighting that if you for the student in the room that do not know the physics-inspired neural network, this is really connected to what Claire is presenting. So training with physics model doesn't mean that you're actually reaching the physics model. You can go even beyond. So that's part also of the additional element of the answer. There is another question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, but I would want to make one comment, which is that since our inputs are from physical models, we actually have not been constraining our machine learning with physics, because we don't want to kind of be redundant and just recover the physical assumptions that were used to generate the synthetic data. But that's right. There is a field on physics constrained machine learning as well. And some people in this field use that.
Just one question from a couple of slides back. You mentioned that to collect data for avalanches, people have to actually go there. What's the difference with maybe sending drones or other systems like that that don't put people in danger?
That would be good. And maybe there is some band that they could collect that would help with it. But with the satellite imagery, it was synthetic aperture radar, SAR, and they did have imagery of the snow. But back in the lab, when humans were trying to look at it and find the avalanche deposits from the imagery, it was a really hard task. So if someone has a drone where the image processing does allow us to detect that, then that would be great. We were operating in a setting where there had been a survey on the ground, and then we had this SAR data. At first we asked, oh, okay, give us examples of segmentations of the SAR that experts have done by looking at that image. And they said it's too hard for humans. We don't have that. But yes, so the question is, what is the measurement on the drone? And is it, how do we get the labels? Because we're still just gonna have some data coming out of the drone. We still need to label it. But that would be a great idea, assuming there's a measurement we can take from a drone that can be easily labeled.
Okay, thank you. There. Oh, other question. Sorry.
I'm glad that there are questions. Yes.
Thank you. So I would like to ask, so you using of this AI in the field of climate change. So I think the climate change, it's a wide challenge. So how do you expect the predictions of AI according to the what humans activities done about the climate? So is it there a challenge between climate predictions with AI and the human activity? So how are they correlating?
Yeah. So when we okay, so first off, if there is a land use change, like we cut down a forest and make a farm, we want to have a better measurement or estimation or even prediction of the impact in making climate change worse, potentially, in space and time. And so that's one thing that we're addressing. But you're right. I was talking to some people that would look at the patterns of migration. If you if your home gets flooded and then you need to move to a different city, you know, how does that change the infrastructure needed in the different city, or the vulnerability of the old city and the new city to the next flood? So yes, I agree that it is important to overlay all the different kinds of data that you have, and that there are various social related data sets that can be helpful. I haven't done a bunch of that, but we're starting a project on wildfire where we're actually going to look at like the ability of humans to escape from various locations. You want to look at road networks, etc. So I'm really glad that you brought that up. Should I go on just a little ways and then conclude?
Yes, you can go on.
Yeah. So we're at this AI summer school, or computer vision summer school, and I'm going to claim, actually in a computer vision example, that we do need to develop new algorithms in this domain. We can't just look up the state-of-the-art algorithm for each problem, but you would think that we could use standard computer vision. Why is that? Well, we have latitude, longitude, and time. So we have a tensor, and then we have some real value, like wind. Now, there are some differences. We have wind at multiple heights, or we could look at wind and pressure and temperature and have many more channels, but we have tensors. Okay. If you look at the most recent top computer vision conferences and journals, and you look for the term spatiotemporal data, it actually is usually algorithms designed for video data. Now, it could be, like a Hollywood movie, or it could be something that you capture with your cell phone camera. But some of the assumptions that really have been exploited in how our community thinks, or how the computer vision community thinks about spatiotemporal data, are these biases that we have for how to deal with video data. So video data has depth, it has objects, the objects have edges. Even if you have a deformable object, it's, a cat walking around or me walking around. So it's deformable, but it's not as deformable as a cloudy pattern that could go away, or a tropical storm that could either become a huge hurricane or disperse. Those patterns have less well-defined edges and are ephemeral, so they can arrive and disappear gradually. So for example, in the domain of temporal downscaling, meaning I have spatiotemporal data, say I have it every 3 hours and I want it every hour. So I'm still trying to interpolate or downscale, but now in the time dimension, and also self-supervised, because we want to be in the unsupervised setting. My student, Nidin Haralal, observed that the state-of-the-art to do this, super slow-mo was state-of-the-art at the time when he worked on this. But in general, whatever method is currently the state-of-the-art most likely uses optical flow. So optical flow is an important computer vision method. You're probably learning about it, and it's great for video. It's looking at groups of pixels that are close in the image, and as the dimension evolves, like the time dimension, usually, they have similar behavior. They kind of move together. But since you don't have depth or objects, this kind of approach can introduce some rather rigid non-physical artifacts, which are shown in these streaks. And to be clear, we did not take super slow-mo, a pre-trained model that was trained on video. We just took the code and completely trained it in our domain, which could either be this fine-grained reanalysis data set or this coarse-grained global climate model data set. And then he also did 2 more different data sets, like one from satellite data and one from a coarser resolution reanalysis product. We got these non-physical artifacts. So he came up with a brand new algorithm, a new pretext task so that you could, in a completely data-driven way that was not looking for edges or objects, do spatiotemporal interpolation. And it might even hallucinate some physics, right? But compared to the ground truth, it's matching a lot of the physics, and it is more physical and smooth. So so with this computer vision skill, I really hope you will go out and do collaborations. We've shown that we can actually work in this sweet spot where we're also advancing algorithms in machine learning or computer vision by addressing, in our case, climate change. And in your case, it could be any application. In fact, we just came out with, we have a position paper coming out in ICML about the importance of application-driven machine learning. I think I'm running quite short on time. Our story about this was with regards with learning under non-stationary. This was using online learning, not even deep learning, and then doing it distributed over space or finding neighborhoods in time. Those were open, and we were able to contribute in algorithmic learning theory, for example. Okay, I will just quickly reiterate that about climate justice, and also first quickly about the cascading hazards. We can predict hurricanes, but these cascading events where multiple extremes happen at once are sort of the goalpost that we should aim for. In terms of climate justice, we want to increase equity and certainly do no harm, but really I think we should have the goal to undo the legacy of climate injustice. This is a pretty unpleasant slide to look at from the US, where a meteorologist made a plot where the grayscale is the population of Black Americans in those spatial regions in the US. And then there's weather radar indicated in green. So we don't have weather radar everywhere. But reading from his legend, he said many majority Black parts of the Southeast USA are relatively far from radar sites, meaning that's harder to gather information about storms impacting these areas. So just stepping back before we think about the models that we choose, the data itself is biased in a way that we don't, we're not even kind of protecting citizens equally here. This is climate injustice. And I'm not saying that AI is the silver bullet. I mean, this is a political and economical issue that needs to be fixed in the US and probably is happening in other places as well, and is a tragedy. But I want to use AI as a lever towards climate data equity, because we can, in that example, take some satellite product that we have everywhere and even in a supervised way, learn models that give us a proxy or a fake radar reading by training in places where we do have radar. Also in the unsupervised or sort of transfer learning frameworks, if there's regions with higher data than others, then we can train models there and fine tune them in the lower data regions. I gave a handy example in the USA, which has a strong legacy of environmental justice, but even more generally, when we think about climate change, the industrial globalized North has emitted more of the anthropogenic carbon that has caused the warming, but also the Europe and North America have really a lot of dense data, more measurements than in some of the developing global South, which is on the forefront of the extreme effects of climate change. So just like we can use AI to go from the high data region of the current observation period in time to predict in the low data future, we should also be trying to do that spatially to combat climate equity. Then I just have a few thank you slides to my Boulder team and my France team. I will mention the journal because now with your computer vision skills, if you work on any environmental topic, not just climate, you could submit. And there's also, this is a project in the US, but also Norway, and it is open to international submissions. Basically, you could form a team with somebody on some environmental topic, including ecology. They're also very interested in biology, and get to be part of a working group where your computer vision skills will be helping with an environmental question. So keep your eyes out for easel. That's it. Happy to take any questions, although actually I'm pretty much out of time. So you probably have the next thing in your schedule. Raul, I'll give you the mic. Actually, I will stop it so that I can see you guys.
Actually fine, because the last slot of the day. So if there are questions in the room. Okay, one question there.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really informative. And I just have one question. Given that, I guess, weather is impacted by a lot of things like landscape and this and that, the present, like the forestry, for example, or like the lack of specific things. How do the models generalize, like on a very small scale? So you train models on places with weather stations, and then you deploy them in places where there are no weather stations. How do you quantify the error, and what does generalization sort of look like in that case?
Yeah, so if there's no weather stations at all, then sort of I say the best we can do, right? And I don't know if you can still see my slide. Yeah, the best we can do is at least in the high. So okay, if we're doing 100% unsupervised learning, what we could do is choose the unsupervised learning algorithm and really fully calibrate it and verify it in the high data region, and then just employ it in the low data region, right? But then we won't really be able to even evaluate how it generalizes if we have absolutely zero data in the low data region. If we have a little bit of data in the low data region, then we would certainly want to use that to fine tune the model that had been highly trained in the high data region. And if we have enough data to fine tune, then we can hold out some of that to evaluate. But you raise a very important question. I mean, it's definitely a chicken and egg problem if you have absolutely no data in those regions.
Thank you. There are other questions. In between, I have a kind of a bigger question, let's say. I wanted to know, how do you relate the use of AI to help climate change at a time where we know that AI is becoming more and more impacting on climate change and on our impact, on that? And also maybe, is frugal learning something that you're looking at, or like, do you have this in mind when you train your models?
So first, oops, you see my notes. First, my proof of concept was not even using deep learning. When I first got climate scientists to think, oh, machine learning is some special sauce, I was not using deep learning. I was using online learning, which is extremely lightweight, iterative update methods. So yes, I am interested in frugal machine learning and green foundation models. It looks like there's an upcoming workshop on green foundation models. But look, now that you know computer vision, people are probably going to tell you, oh, it is wasting compute. Okay, maybe I'll just put this up again. And if you come and choose to work on like AI for weather or AI for climate predictions, it's the one area where we have some win, and that's down here. So climate models are trying to predict these long-term scenarios in the future to make IPCC reports, and it's true. They're using a huge amount of compute, high performance computing, simulating every single differential equation of every little atmospheric and oceanic process, albeit at a large grid, takes a lot of time. So if you want to predict forward 100 years. You have to let these things run weeks or months. So AI can do that much, much more cheaply. So it's actually one of the few areas where the state of the art was using more compute, if you can believe it, and we can actually drastically reduce the compute if we use AI, what we call emulators. So we can look at the input conditions and the outputs. Those gives us our labeled training pairs, and we can then train these emulators that can speed things up for lower cost. But yeah, it's not just AI that is part of the problem, but in general, modern day science has become computational. Modern day science is using a lot of compute. And yeah, there's a lot of head scratching about how do we do research that is needed, without using compute. But yeah, ways of doing more frugal computing and frugal use of data are needed.
Great. Thanks a lot for the answer. There any more question? Yes, apparently. Oh,
So thank you for the presentation. I wanted to have some advice to have a good annotated data set because my current project focuses on land use, land cover change detection. But the bigger problem is how to annotate the data and how to know that the annotation is good. Thank you.
So, so you want to detect the changes in land use?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you can look at, I think Google Earth Engine and also Landsat have land cover segmentations. And then you can look at which years they get updated in. But unfortunately, it's true that it would be just updated annually, even if the change, happens sometime in the year. So I do think that's a bit of a tough problem. Indeed, this student, we were going to take, we looked at some places in Brazil where we knew that the forest had been cut down. And then we wanted to see when does it go from forest land to low shrub land. And those land use segmentations don't get updated really right when the change happens. So that's pretty difficult. Another thing would maybe be that IBM and NASA have gotten together to take a lot of satellite remote sensing data and hopefully share the data, but also train a foundation model on it. So then that foundation model, maybe you could fine tune it for the cases where you do know that there's been land change.
Yeah, thank you. Now I am using the dynamical word who provide a near real-time global 10-meter land use land cover in parallel with Sentinel-2. But I don't know in my case, in the green green work in Senegal, I don't know if it is good for this study area or not.
That's something I don't know either, but there's something called IRD, like it's Institut Recherche Durable. It's French. They do a lot of projects in Senegal. But it sounds like the first database that you have sounds pretty good. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know precisely You could go to the Climate Change AI website, and there are message boards. You might be able to find a subset on land use to connect you with somebody that does have the answer.
All right, another question.
Yes. I'm not sure how to define this question or discussion. So I'm just curious what's happening right now. There's increase in turbulence. One example is Singapore Airlines that happened like a month ago.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so is there any hope to be able to predict those extreme events from AI? And if not, I mean, what would be the hard part? Should we, as you are a climate expert, like, so. Yeah.
It could be, sorry, I'm just delaying my next meeting so that I can talk to you. It could be that that's exactly what they're talking about when they're talking about these more extreme energy patterns. So basically, on average, globally average, there's evidence that wind is decreasing. But you have something with like a probability distribution. The mean increases. Where does the probability mass go? It probably has to go into the tails. So we are potentially getting higher probabilities of extreme windiness, which could cause some of those weird turbulence patterns. But I'm an AI researcher, so I don't claim to be the expert on those meteorological questions. But yes, I heard that air travel could be getting more dangerous.
Okay, thanks a lot, Claire. I think we can close here. I hear also that you have other meeting. So again, thanks a lot for the time and for the great talk.
Thank you. Next time I would like to come in person. Have a great summer school. Bye-bye.
Thanks.